So you want the inside scoop on Chief Justice Warren Burger, how he really ran the Supreme Court, how he was different from Earl Warren. Was it truly the Burger Court? We're going to find out. We're diving deep into Bob Woodward's book, The Brethren, Inside the Supreme Court, to expose all the juicy details, the power struggles, the personalities, everything that shaped this era.
Yeah, this book is like having a key to a secret room in the Supreme Court, you know? It lets us peek behind the curtain and see what was happening at a time when America was changing like crazy. And it's not just about the big legal decisions they made.
Right.
It's about Burger's leadership, how he got along with the other justices, and how his own ideas about the law steered the court.
It's like that scene, you remember where Burger's walking through the Supreme Court building?
Well, yeah.
Like before the other justices have even come back from their summer break, and he's pointing out all the things he wants to change. Talk about making a statement, right?
Sure. He definitely wanted to show he was in charge. He had a vision for a court that ran smoothly, a court that wasn't so eager to jump into every social issue. He really thought Warren let things get out of hand and even wanted to rein in the power of those law clerks. But Woodward hints that not everyone was thrilled about this, you know? There was pushback.
So how much power did Burger actually have?
Well, the book really gets into the power of the Chief Justice to pick who writes the majority opinion.
Oh, yeah.
And that's huge, right?
That's a lot of influence.
It totally shapes how a ruling is understood.
Totally.
It's strategic. Woodward says Burger knew this and used it sometimes in ways that caused controversy. He knew how important it was to frame an opinion the right way because it would affect lower courts and even how the public saw things.
And then you got to talk about the personalities.
Oh, the personalities.
Oh, the personality. We get these amazing descriptions of each justice. Black, he's like this fiery liberal. Douglas, he's the maverick, always going his own way. Then you've got Harlan, super committed to sticking to precedent. I mean, what a mix, right?
Can you imagine being in a room with all those big personalities? Trying to wrangle them all?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well,
and the whole time they're grappling with this big question. Do you stick with past rulings, what they call spare decisis?
Oh.
Or do you try to change with the times, adapt to all the new stuff happening in society? And this plays out in cases about school desegregation, the exclusionary rule, you know, when they can't use illegally obtained evidence, obscenity cases, all this controversial stuff.
And, you know, it's interesting, like in that Alexander v. Holmes County case, the court under Burger said, okay, schools need to desegregate immediately.
Right.
But Woodward reveals that behind the scenes, not all the justices agreed on the legal reasoning for it.
Wow.
So even when they're all voting the same way,
Right.
there can be these deeper splits, you know.
Yeah, Burger really wanted them to present a united front, even if it meant hiding those disagreements. And was that a good strategy? Did it just kick the can down the road, you know, create more problems later?
Especially since he was appointed by Nixon, right?
Yeah.
People were wondering, was this just Nixon's court?
Right. Was he just carrying out Nixon's agenda? The book makes it seem more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Like, remember when Burger sided against Nixon in the Pentagon Papers case? He let them publish those classified documents about the Vietnam War, even though Nixon really didn't want them to.
It's true. That was a major blow to Nixon, wasn't it?
It's huge.
Yeah. Showed that Burger wasn't just a yes man.
Totally.
But then, what did he want for the court? What was his vision? And did he get it? That's a big question.
Okay, so let's break it down. The book describes Burger as wanting a more restrained court. Basically, he didn't want the court to overturn laws so easily or create new rights all the time.
Yeah.
And this fits with a lot of conservative legal thinking at the time, right? Like a reaction against all the big changes the activist Warren court had made. Exactly. You know, he wasn't a fan of some of those big Warren-era decisions.
Oh, yeah.
Like Miranda v. Arizona, you know, expanding rights for people accused of crimes. He wanted to pull back on some of that.
Did he succeed?
Well, yeah, kind of. The Burger court definitely became more conservative, more focused on following procedures, but it wasn't a complete 180 from the Warren court, you know? They kept some of the important precedents in place, like Brown v. Board, and they even expanded rights in some areas like gender discrimination. It was a mix.
Okay, so what about his stance on stare decisis, following precedent? The book says Burger wasn't a huge fan. He saw it as a roadblock to making changes.
Yeah, he thought the court shouldn't be stuck with old rulings that didn't make sense anymore. But even some of the conservative justices, like John Harlan, really believed in stare decisis.
Yeah.
He said it was super important for keeping the law stable and predictable.
Right.
So even within this conservative court, there were these tensions, you know? different ways of looking at the law. It wasn't just one big block of agreement.
It's so interesting how you could have a group of people who seem to agree on the surface, but then you get deeper, and there's all this nuance and disagreement.
Totally. And that's what makes this period so fascinating to study. You see these shifting alliances, people disagreeing on one case but then agreeing on another. It all depended on the issue.
Speaking of issues, how did the Burger Court handle all those cases related to the Vietnam War? Protests, people objecting to the draft, even whether the war itself was constitutional. I mean, that must have been super intense.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because personally, Berger supported the war, but as a judge, he kind of avoided taking strong stances in those Vietnam cases. It's like he knew the court was divided and the country was too, and he didn't want to make things worse. So we often let the president and Congress handle those national security issues.
But there was that time when Justice Douglas tried to stop the bombing of Cambodia, right?
Oh, yeah. Douglas, he was always pushing boundaries. He thought the bombing was illegal and tried to use the court to stop it. Talk about a clash between social and political forces, right? It all came to a head at the Supreme Court. But in the end, he couldn't get a majority to agree with him.
So the court wasn't setting war policy directly, but still got caught up in all those big issues of the day. And this brings us to something I find super interesting: the relationships between the justices. Their friendships, their rivalries, they're making these huge decisions. But there are also moments of affection and humor. The Brethren really shows the human side of these powerful figures.
It does. It makes them seem real, not just like names in a textbook,
Exactly.
We see their quirks, their struggles, even their funny moments, like how obsessed Berger was with remodeling the Supreme Court building, or how Blackmun took notes on absolutely everything.
So we've talked about school desegregation, the Vietnam War. What about Watergate? This whole scandal must have been crazy for the court, especially since Berger was so connected to Nixon.
Oh, Watergate was a turning point for everyone. But it's amazing. The justices put their personal feelings about Nixon aside and upheld the rule of law. Their decision in United States v. Nixon, all of them agreed, they forced him to turn over those secret tapes. It was a landmark moment for the court, for the whole country.
It's like the court that Nixon helped create ended up being his downfall. It's almost poetic justice.
It is. It shows how the court can stand up for itself, even when things get super political. They really were a check on Nixon's power.
So we've seen Berger's ambition, his push to change the court, all the challenges he faced both inside and outside the court. What about his legacy? Did he create a Berger court that was really different from the Warren era?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians are still debating it. He definitely made his mark, but it's not a simple yes or no answer. The court did become more conservative, more focused on procedures, less willing to push for big social changes. But, like we've been saying, it wasn't a clean break from the Warren court. There was a lot of overlap, a lot of compromise, a lot of surprises.
Right, it wasn't just a straight line from point A to point B.
Exactly. The Brethren reminds us that the Supreme Court, even though it seems so powerful and permanent, is still a human institution. People, with all their beliefs and flaws, shape it. And it's also affected by the events happening in the world.
It really highlights how even the highest court in the country can't escape the messiness of politics and human nature.
Exactly. And that's maybe why the court is still so captivating, right? It reflects all those big struggles and debates that are happening in society.
Okay, so we've covered Berger's vision for the court, his leadership style, his impact on big areas of law, and all those complicated relationships with the other justices. But we haven't talked much about Justice Harry Blackmun. You mentioned you were especially interested in how he changed while he was on the court with Berger.
Yeah, Blackmun's fascinating. He starts out as this quiet guy from the Midwest, very close to Berger. But over time, he finds his own voice. He becomes the one who writes Roe v. Wade.
Oh, wow. The book says that at first, Berger wanted to write that Roe opinion himself.
Really?
Yeah. But then he gave it to Blackmun. That's a huge turning point, wouldn't you say?
Huge. That decision shaped both of their legacies, and it's had a lasting impact on the court. And it's interesting because Blackmun, people saw him as conservative at first, but then he became more liberal on issues like abortion and the death penalty.
It's like he found his true calling as a judge through these really difficult cases. He wasn't afraid to change his mind, to wrestle with these tough moral and legal questions, even if it meant going against his friends. So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive into the Brethren, what do you think are the most important things for our listeners to understand about the Berger Court?
The The Burger Court was a really complicated time. It was definitely a conservative court, but it was also dealing with so much change and upheaval in America, Vietnam, Watergate, the women's rights movement.
And it's not like Burger got his way all the time. Even though he wanted a more restrained court, he was constantly dealing with these strong personalities on the court, all these justices with their own ideas about the law.
Exactly. I mean, you had these huge debates about stare decisis, about how much power the court should have, how to interpret the Constitution. It wasn't just a simple conservative or liberal thing,
It seems like the book is really showing us how the court actually worked, the dynamics between all these different people and ideas.
Yes. It takes you beyond those simple labels and shows you how these decisions got made, all the drama behind the scenes.
It's like we're right there in the room with them, watching them argue, compromise, laugh, get frustrated.
Totally. You see how their personal relationships influence the cases too, in good ways and bad. Burger and Douglas didn't get along at all. He was closer to Blackmun, but even that changed over time. Then you have Brennan and Rehnquist respecting each other, but also butting heads sometimes.
It's a good reminder that these were real people, not just robes and gavels.
Oh, yeah.
They had strengths and weaknesses, and they had to figure out how to work together to make these big decisions that affected everyone. It's a delicate balance.
It is. And the Brethren captures that tension really well.
So for someone listening who's now learned all about this time period, what's the one thing you hope they take away from this deep dive into the Burger Court?
Well, I hope they see that the Burger Court wasn't just some simple conservative monolith. It was so much more complex than that. It wasn't just about trying to undo everything the Warren Court had done. There was change for sure, but also a lot that stayed the same. And all those personalities, those different ways of thinking about the law, that really mattered. Plus, you can't forget about what was happening in the country at the time, all that social and political turmoil.
It really shows how human the court is, even with all that power and authority.
Absolutely. The Brethren does such a great job of showing us the drama that was happening behind the scenes, all those debates and decisions that changed American law. And those changes, they're still affecting us today.
If you're all interested in how power works, in the stories behind those big legal decisions that shaped America, you've got to read The Brethren. We'll put a link in the show notes so you can grab a copy.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Supreme Court, make sure you subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on any of our future explorations. We've got so many more fascinating topics and conversations coming up.
We love hearing from you too. Leave us a comment and tell us what other rabbit holes you want us to jump into next.